the Within Orb podcast. Come get Within Orb. Hello, my name is Jenn Zahrt, and welcome to Within Orb, a production of the Celestial Arts Education Library, a podcast bringing people together around the love of astrology, books. Join me as I interview people about the astrology books that changed their life and practice. You can support the podcast at withinorb.com. Welcome to another episode of Within Orb, and today we're heading out over to New York to talk with Ronnie Dreyer. Ronnie, welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm glad to be here. It's wonderful talking to you. I love this show. I listen to all your podcasts.
It's so happy to have you on. Yeah. So, last time I saw you was before the pandemic, and it was in Chicago at the last UAC.
We saw each other then, and we had a nice lunch with a lot of people from the Sophia Center. And then we also saw each other at ESAR.
Ooh, you're reminding me. Yep, in Denver in 2022. It's all a blur. Yeah. It's all a blur. This pandemic
well, I spoke
blur.
to you in the trade show. You know, there were so many people going
Exactly. Yeah. All right. So now you're in the hot seat.
Mm-hmm.
But before we get to the 3 hot books, I want to know, what was your first astrology book, Ronnie?
My first astrology book was The Compleat Astrologer by Derek and Julia Parker. And there's kind of an interesting story. So these books are all sort of about my life as an astrologer anyway, because there are so many books I would recommend. But when I was a kid, I'm a city kid. I was brought up in Brooklyn and Queens, and my parents, we would go away during the summer and, maybe go, not camping, but we go swimming and things like that. But they weren't people who looked at the sky. I always loved learning about the planets and the stars in grade school. And because we lived in New York, my dad would sometimes take us to the Hayden Planetarium, which is now called the Rose Planetarium.
Lovely.
And he did it because I was interested in it. And he would, we would go and look at the sky and everything. So fast forward, my dad was a sales and marketing manager for McGraw-Hill Book Company. So he brought a lot of books home. Whenever they would get a new book in, he would bring it home. And at various times, he was marketing manager for the college division, then the trade division. And when it was 1972, I know exactly, I was 19, and I had taken a break from one college before I transferred to another. And this was very kind of serendipitous and synchronistic. At the same time, I was studying theater, and I was going to theater school, and everybody was going to see astrologers. And I had really I never thought about it. And so I went to see an astrologer because they all wanted to know if they were going to make it in show business.
Right.
And I went to this astrologer in New York, who they were all going to, and he was a Kabbalistic astrologer. Around that same time, my dad came home and brought home this beautiful big coffee table book, illustrated. And he said to me, "Oh, you love astronomy, so here is the book that you might like." But it was The Compleat Astrologer. And he didn't, because there was a lot of astronomy in there. And I started reading this book and I was mesmerized. It is an amazing book because you look at it and it's this, big coffee table book. In fact, I still have it right here next to me.
The very one.
The very one. Yes. Wow. I have it right in front of me, and it's the cover is gone, but it was it was published by McGraw-Hill. It was first published in the UK, and then McGraw-Hill took it on, and it was, they didn't really know what to do with it. And when I went through this book, not only is it beautifully illustrated, it starts with the history, and then it goes through the sun signs and the houses and the planets and progressions and synastry. It is still a really great book for beginning students. It's amazing. And then in the back, they have all these tables. And of course, I started, what's my ascendant? And that was probably the first time I ever even knew what an ascendant was. But then what happened was, interestingly enough, McGraw-Hill didn't know what to do with it. And they sold the rights to Macmillan, which was another big publishing company. And Macmillan did very well with it. It really became, in America, a bestseller.
Yeah.
And it's a big book. So I didn't kind of take it with me. I went to school. I transferred to University of New Mexico. But every time I would go back home, I would, of course, always look through this book. And it's just a wonderful book. And many, many years later, when I was at an AA conference in the UK, Derek and Julia were there.
What did that feel like to see the authors of this book that had influenced you?
It was great. It was like, it had to be at least 35 years later.
Yeah.
And, I just went up to them. I just had to tell them this story about how, my first astrology book was The Compleat Astrologer. And, they said, "Oh, that's nice." It's like,
we get that a lot.
Yeah, they were very nice, but it was like, oh my God, these two people they're still together.
Mm-hmm.
And of course they've created so many books, since then. They're a name in the UK. You say Derek and Julia Parker and everybody knows who they are.
Yeah.
So that was my first introduction actually to astrology.
That's so lovely.
Great. I know.
I bet McGraw-Hill's kicking themselves like, how did Macmillan make it a bestseller?
I don't know if my dad was part of the trade division then, but if he was, he probably wouldn't have known necessarily what to do with it. But he used to get all the books that came through, and we'd always get copies of all the books that McGraw-Hill published.
Wow, what a blessing. Oh,
yeah,
that's amazing.
It was a great book.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
I know. It is a nice book. And it's beautifully illustrated. It's just a gorgeous book.
Well, and the tables in the back and the ephemerides they have, it's not a joke. It's really titled properly. It's complete.
Right. Yeah.
They take you through it.
Totally. I mean, I'm looking at it now. It's like until 1975.
Yeah. Well, and
they reprinted
well, there's that. It needs maybe an updated one. It does come out in a lot of editions. We have probably 6 different versions of that book here. I mean, it's been reprinted and redesigned many, many times. And I don't know if you know this, but in the episode where Rod Suskin appears on the January 1st episode of Within Orb, mm-hmm. Rod Suskin told us that this book passed the South African censorship.
Really?
Like in South Africa, they had a huge lockdown on what could be printed during apartheid. And for whatever reason, this book made it through, whereas many other astrology books in English were banned or not allowed to be produced. Or I think a lot of the things having to do with, you'd have to go back and listen to that episode, but I think it was that a lot of those materials needed to be produced from South Africa proper, and they weren't allowing a lot of foreign books in. I could be wrong about that.
I did listen to his episode because I saw that he also learned from this book, that was the first book that he learned from too. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I know. It's fun to see how different people get in through like, oh, you got in. That was your first book. It's like you're in a little cohort,
But I didn't really get into astrology until a few years later. I mean, actually reading books, but we'll get to that. But this was like the first book that, I ever even heard. Really, I didn't know much about astrology. I must have known I was a Taurus. I must have read things in the newspaper, but other than that, nothing really. That was never within my wheelhouse. So that's when it happened.
All right. We're going to go to a deserted island, and I'm going to let you have 3 astrology books and your ephemeris of choice. What would your 3 books be?
So the first book I put on the list is, because I do Indian astrology and I do Western astrology, but it's a book called Phaladeepika. And it's by a writer called Mantreswara. And he wrote probably around the 13th century. So he came into writing this in the second millennium, which was after Muslim rule came into India. So this book is classical Jyotisha, which is Indian astrology, but it also has, you can see some influences from Arabic astrology and Persian astrology. Mostly because he talks a lot about the nodes. The nodes were not really used much in the first millennium. And I know they were used with Parashara, but the whole idea with Parashara, people know, is that Parashara was edited and re-edited many times so that you really don't know which parts of the book were done in the first millennium or which parts of the book were done after that.
Wow.
But this book, Phaladeepika, Deepika means light or, shining a light on. And Phala is the word for fruit or results. It really literally means shining a light on the results. You can take it, the results, of your chart or horoscopy. But really the greater meaning of results would be the results of many lifetimes, because your chart is really a representation of the many lifetimes that you've been incarnated into. It has that double meaning, which Sanskrit does have. A lot of times you read Sanskrit, but it has a much deeper meaning. And for people who know the culture and know the language, they know the deeper meaning. But you see it written in a kind of shorthand. But the reason I take this book with me is because it's a book I've been translating myself. I went back to school to get my master's in Sanskrit because I wanted to translate.
Wow.
And this is the book that my guru in India, when I went to India, chanted to me. So he would read the chapter, the first chapter. He would sing these stanzas to me and then tell me the English. And he gave me the book that he was working from, and he'd say, go home with it and just write from it. I still have a lot of the notes so for me, this book is just also very sentimental because it was the first book that I really learned on that was classical Jyotish and classical Indian astrology. And because he sang to me and chanted to me from this book, it has a really special
You
meaning.
literally received it with your ears.
Exactly.
Not just reading.
Which is the way classical astrologers in Greek, Latin, that's what they did. They would sing and they would translate. It's just like the Homeric hymns or something like that. I mean, that is originally how astrology was passed down to the different cultures from Babylonia onward, Persia. So yeah, he did it that way. It was wonderful.
So what do you make of this mixture then of the Indian tradition finding some influence with Persian and Arabic sources? Like if you were going to kind of characterize what the flavor of that is as a practitioner, what do you get?
Well, I think the thing is that this book is still kind of classical Indian astrology or Hindu astrology. I mean, some people call Vedic astrology. There's a reason some people don't like that term. Mm-hmm. But if you read Parashara, for instance, or Varahamihira, Jataka, it's going to be very much the same, but there's always going to be nuances that are a bit different. This book in particular has certain what we call yogas or combinations that are a bit different than what you find in Parashara. Some of them have to do with what we now know as mutual reception. So that is something that is in all the classical texts, but in this text, it's divided into 3 types of mutual receptions. And then we have in this book a chapter on the transits. That's why a lot of people think that transits weren't important. But transits are a very important part of Indian astrology, which is why even if you don't do Indian astrology, you have that in common with Western astrology. And I don't know how much the transits in other books. I haven't really seen classical Jyotisha texts that focus on the transits as much. And I think that could have been the influence also of the Western astrology, of the Arabic and the Persian traditions. And even the Hellenistic tradition, of course, shows up a lot in Indian astrology texts. So, that's, I think, what sets this book a little bit apart. But otherwise, a lot of it is the same. The nodes are very much a focus on this book too. The nodes in the houses and things that have to do that. And I think that also came more from the Western traditions. And then as you went on to the 14th, 15th, 16th century, you had what's called Tajika. And Tajika is a separate brand of Indian astrology. And the word Tajika itself literally means Persian. So Tajika is a combination of some Persian techniques and Indian astrology techniques. But the things that are most important in Tajika that are not really in this text are, number 1, solar returns and horary astrology. And that's what they really got from the Western tradition. That's the mixture, which is kind of interesting. So you get the solar returns, which are called Varshapala. Again, the word pala, which is the fruit of the year. And then you get the horary text, which is Prashna. That you get from the Western tradition. So it is interesting. Yeah, it's fascinating how
I love that.
different centuries and different years, they kept adding, I think, to the Indian astrology texts.
I'm also loving the mini Sanskrit lesson you're giving us. So that's amazing.
The word pala is great because it's results, it's fruit, it's just what you kind of, when you reap, that's what you sow, what you get in the end.
Right.
And and it has like I said, literally it just means results or fruit. But when you really think about what it means, it has a lot to do with the different lifetimes that if you really are looking at the text, the horoscope is a reflection of the different lifetimes and the karma that you bring into this lifetime.
Love it. And I also love learning more. I mean, it's, having not personally studied anything in the Indian tradition, I've never heard of this book before. So I feel like I'm just getting this whole new brain tickle. Like, This is so cool. So yeah, I'm glad you're bringing that one with you.
But you studied German, and German does have certain relationship to Sanskrit as well. Did you come across that as well?
In its linguistic roots? That has so far, you fast forward a pandemic and a kid later, there's a lot of deep structures present, yes, and overt memory focused on now and not back then now. So, but yeah, I think the Indo-European root sounds do have a kind of, there was a moment that happened, I'll just share actually something that was in my middle high German class, which was the oldest form of German that we studied. And the teacher put a word up on the board, and back when you had things like chalkboards, and she said, "What do you think this means?" And it was an exam. We had to write about it. And it was M-A with a caret and an S-set. It was a Maß. And in my mind, I just had this like flash of all of the words where that was a root of it. And I was like, measure. It means temperance. It means, everything in right relation to a certain extent, so you have to think about what is the Maß, Regelmäßigkeit, unmäßig. There's all these like roots with that sound, or all these words with that sound as the root. Yeah, so it just was one of those things that the Germans have a word for this. It's called a Sprachgefühl. Mm-hmm. It's a feeling for the language.
Right.
And a lot of times my work with German comes from that fiery place more than it does from a logical Virgo type place. It's just a sense of it that just comes, and then she was like, that's spot on. And I'm like, I don't even know how I knew that. Probably my ancestors were just putting a lightning bolt in my brain, like, this is what it means. I'm like, okay. Mm-mm. But it was a feeling. It was very much a feeling-based knowledge of just kind of getting it, So, and I do love learning language. So I think learning Sanskrit would be exciting.
It's going to be easy for you.
Yeah. With all my copious free time.
Trust me, it's not easy. It's not easy. And I'm far from a great scholar, but it's great trying to do some translating, which is why I learned it. So this book is great. It's a shorter book than, let's say, Parashara. Parashara's Horus Shastra. It's huge.
Right.
So this is kind of a little bit more condensed.
So when you say you're translating it, are you going to be publishing that translation?
Oh, probably not.
Oh,
I don't think so. I mean, I did some translation, not of this text, of another text that I had to do for my master's degree. It was on women's astrology, and I translated 5 chapters that hadn't really been translated into English. But that was a whole other text that was much earlier, maybe from the 4th century. Yeah. Oh, the texts go back because they do go back all that way. Yeah. This one is like later. Were
they preserved on palm leaves? Because I've heard from Kenneth Miller that a lot of the texts coming out of the Indian subcontinent were written on palm leaves and therefore lost.
Yeah, they had scribes that were doing it. The thing is that they had to they kept redoing it and redoing them. So some of them are a little different in nature, and a lot of them actually were found later. Interestingly enough, they're still finding things in Nepal, because a lot of documents were, when they left India, certain people left India, they went up to Nepal. At least the Buddhists did as well, and they took a lot of paper with them, and that's where they kind of have been preserved, interestingly enough. They kept rescribing them and redoing them. So the things that you kind of look at now that you see are not the originals, but they're scribes redoing it. And that's why sometimes they're a little different. You can tell the differences, but some of them, like, a letter is missing or a word is missing, and things like that. Yeah.
Scribal error,
There are texts that are missing for sure. There are definitely texts that are missing, or there are things that you have to put them together because there are fragments of certain texts. But this one is pretty good because it was from about the 13th century. So by that time it was well preserved, in a text.
Yeah, exactly. Imagine stepping into a room of 5,000 astrology books, turning a corner and stepping into a room of 2,000 more. The Celestial Arts Education Library is every astrologer's dream, and it can be yours. I invite you to come support CAELi before you can visit physically. Your support will mean the creation of 52 new episodes of Within Orb next year, 4 issues of the CAELi Review, our inaugural journal, and countless book talks, events, classes for our community. Visit our website, www.caeli.institute/support, to select your level of care. Please help support CAELi into the future, our future, so that we may study the future together. Thank you for listening. Please enjoy the rest of the show. All right. So what would your second book be?
My second book is called Person Centered Astrology by Dane Rudhyar. And I couldn't not take a Dane Rudhyar book with me. Again, most of these books now are going to be Western, but they can be related to anything. Dane Rudhyar was the first person when I started getting back into astrology, when I traveled to Europe. I lived in Amsterdam, and that was really when I started studying methodically Western astrology. Then I went to India. Then I came back from India and continued to study. And when I started to do readings for people, this book, Person Centered Astrology, really has a lot to do with doing charts, horoscopes for people, but with the philosophy that Dane Rudhyar set forward, which is humanistic astrology. So the first book I ever read of his, The Astrology Personality from 1936, was huge. So it's a very big book, and it's so in-depth and dense. This one, Person Centered Astrology, is a series of articles. And from 1969 to 1971, Dane Rudhyar created different booklets, like these little booklets. And then he compiled them and put them together in this book, Person Centered Astrology, which is from 1976. And the articles are great. And I think everybody should read this book. It's not the one that people know of his, but if you're doing readings for people, it's a beautiful book because he really talks about how you need to approach charts and just approach people. And that's really the whole idea of humanistic. It's person-based rather than event-based. Even though he talks about events, but he'll criticize, he'll say, well, if you have a hit, let's say you see an event and you see a transit and you think, oh, that's wonderful. It's not enough. You have to do your research and make sure that it's not a one-off. But also when you're dealing with your clients, it's not something that you should brag about. You should figure out how to use what you've learned in astrology and approach a human. That's the whole idea of humanistic. Really, how do you help somebody with all this information? It's not enough just to say, oh, I did it. I'm so wonderful. And that's what was really good when I started doing readings for people. This book for me was really like a Bible in a way. And it was a great reminder of, we all have our ego trips and we all love getting hits. Oh, wow, I predicted that. I mean, that's human nature. And it's not to say we shouldn't do it. But when we talk to people, we really have to understand that we're dealing with people with sensitivities and, you have to be very, understanding. And my favorite chapter in this book, I know, I can talk, so I just will remind you how much I can talk. But again, these are different booklets that he did. And that's what's nice about it, because Dane Rudhyar can be so dense. So these are, they're not that long. They're maybe 15 to 20 pages each. And he has one chapter called Astrology as a Discipline of Mind. And then he has Astrology as Karma Yoga. So for me, this book was great also because he is very, very knowledgeable about the East and very knowledgeable about, yoga and Eastern philosophy and, really talks about astrology as karma yoga. And karma yoga is simply the idea of work, of discipline. Of the yogas, that's the one that involves just working and disciplining and focusing. And, that's what he reminds us of, how to really be disciplined and looking at astrology as a discipline. It's just a series of articles, and I think it's a great book. I always go back to it to remind myself sometimes of why I'm doing this work.
Thank you for pointing out also that it's digestible, because I feel like when people hear Rudhyar, they're confronted with a whole syllabus of material, and it's like, where do you get started? The lunation cycle is a discrete transmission. The degree symbol book, the astrological mandala, is really fun to do bibliomancy with.
Yeah.
But, when you think about trying to wrap your mind around his whole philosophy, it can be daunting. So this seems like a very nice entryway.
But the other thing is the Astrology of Personality was from 1936. These are articles from 1969 to 71. So you really think how many years later, finally he's, maybe realized.
He can distill it down into a transmission.
And I didn't include this book, but A Guide to the Humanistic Astrologer. Is that exactly the name of the book?
The Handbook for the Humanistic Astrologer was one of my picks.
I know.
I picked that one.
I know. And that really distills a lot of things that Rudhyar talked about, which was why that book was when I was learning astrology, that was one of the books my teachers, always recommended. So that's a great book too. And
Yeah.
so it takes a lot of the Rudhyar stuff and makes it very palatable, I think.
Totally. And I think even just, I do believe the more I'm hanging out with the books at CAELi, I think that books have an osmosis quality where even if they're just in your field, they're telling you things and you don't actually have to read them, even though it is helpful if you do actually read them. But the handbook for the Humanistic Astrologer has a very specific vibration where any sentence you read, even if you're just holding it in your hands, it's like you're instantly a better astrologer. I just believe that in my working with it.
No, because I remember that was one of your picks because I do listen to this podcast.
Yeah. Well, it was hard to pick. And then I realized I picked a bunch of handbooks and I was like, oh, wait,
It's hard.
So
it's very hard.
I was like, I needed resources. I didn't know until I was on the show myself that this is a very hard question to answer, but I'm still going to keep asking.
No, you should. It's great because it makes because it made me actually go back and really think about it. I mean, I thought this was a great question.
Well, it makes you really find your values too, because then you're thinking about, okay, well, some answers to the question are immediate, like, well, now I would take this. And others are more sentimental, like this was something that meant a lot to me. So you can see where people fall on a spectrum.
Right, exactly.
And even you're bringing a whole brand new book. I'm going to try to say it, Phaladeepika.
Great, that's good.
Yeah. All right. So what would your third book be?
So the third book I picked, and again, I'm just going to say that I could have picked Liz Green, Arroyo, Rob Hand, all these people on my journey, but I picked Predictive Astrology, The Eagle and the Lark by Bernadette Brady. I read it originally. It was called The Eagle and the Lark. And, it's just this fable of the eagle and the lark and how they went and, made music for the gods. It's a beautiful little fable. And then it was republished. I guess they called it then Predictive Astrology. Maybe they wanted people to really know what it was about. Maybe The Eagle and the Lark was a little. So then so the original publication is 92 and this one was published in 99. And I love the way Bernadette teaches, and there are so many books that talk about prediction. But the reason I like this book is because she really made me see the cycles of eclipses a little bit differently. And I'm really, one of my great passions are the nodes and eclipse cycles. She doesn't talk particularly about the Metonic cycle, but she talks about the Saros cycle in a way that I never really thought about the Saros cycle. And also, if I was on a desert island, she gives the dates of all the eclipses.
Yeah.
So this way you know exactly when an eclipse is going to be there. Yeah, it's great. And she talks about the Saros cycle. She actually numbers them a little differently than, let's say, NASA does. If you go on NASA, the website, NASA's website, they have the Saros cycle eclipses because the astronomers really are, the Saros cycle is very, very interesting because it has to do with the geometry of each eclipse. But she talks about them in terms of the date that they started, because they can go over many centuries, and looks at them and really gives a certain nuance to them. Like, this has a Venus-Neptune feel, or this one has a Saturn-Mars feel. And I mean, the book is not just about eclipses. It's really about transits and progressions. And she does a lot of examples. I think it's really one of the better predictive astrology books that there are. And she also, by doing these eclipses and talks about the Saros cycle, is really, I think, one of the first books that really does it in depth. I mean, Jansky did it, one of the early people who did it, and she learned a lot from Jansky, but she then made it much larger. She expanded on it. When I saw Bernadette at a UAC in 98 in Atlanta, I was getting this eclipse that was going to be exactly on my ascendant, and I was really nervous about it. And she was just giving me a whole other point of view about this eclipse. And I just, I like the way she approaches things.
Right. So what I'm hearing you say with this story you've just shared is that if the eclipse family has a certain signature, it might not be as horrific as if it has perhaps a more malefic signature to start. So the sort of fable of an eclipse being something negative might not pertain to an eclipse family that has more positive significations.
Exactly. Yeah. And she gives the eclipses a lot more nuance, a lot more depth. I don't think eclipses are always awful. I mean, I know that it has that kind of reputation. I mean, because I work with them a lot. But I think what she's done with the Saros cycle has really opened my eyes to all the possibilities. In addition, like I said, the book is not just about eclipses, but that was why I like this one in particular, because she just has, and it has the whole, listing of eclipses. So you kind of can see, where they are.
Yeah. There's nothing else like it. I think it's
Yeah.
definitely a
So I
thing.
really liked the book.
Very cool.
Yeah.
All right. So if you were going to help somebody get into astrology, they come to you and they say, hey, Ronnie, I want to be an astrologer. Which books do you put in their hand?
Okay, and this is also a very difficult question because I have to go back.
If you've been teaching for decades, yes, I'm sure.
I know. What did I go back? What did I start with? I know, I'm sure there's plenty of books. I mean, there's the whole Marion March, Joan McEvers series of books. Yeah. But I chose another book that was a book that you got into, and it's Alan Oken's Compleat Astrology.
You're starting with a complete and ending with a complete. This is the complete episode with Ronnie.
I know. And when I started to really get into astrology again after reading The Compleat Astrologer, then a few years passed, and then I got into it methodically, really learned it. I was living in Amsterdam, and it was the mid-70s, 76, 77, and there weren't like tons and tons of books from America. They had a lot of Dutch books. There's still a lot of many Dutch astrologers. So you couldn't really get as many books. But we did get the 3 little books that Alan did, one after the other. He started with the As Above, So Below, which was really just a general idea of the planets and the houses and signs. And then the horoscope, The Road and Its Travelers. I wrote all this down, so I remembered it. And that book was great. That book it was a wonderful book also for learning how to put everything together, planets in the houses, planets and signs. And I even still use some of his keywords for especially for Mars and Saturn. He would say it was like driving with the brakes on. And I always thought that was the way he described the Mars-Saturn aspect. And then the third book was Astrology, Evolution and Revolution. So those books were done between 73 and 76. Shows how old I am, but okay. And those were the books I read. But they are available actually on Amazon, but they're like $30 each. But then Bantam put those 3 books together in a complete edition called Alan Oken's Compleat Astrology. And as I told you, though, there were 2 chapters from that last book that were deleted from this one.
It's important to notice what goes missing.
I know. So if you can get that Astrology, Evolution, Revolution, it will have 2 missing chapters. But I think it's a great book. I mean, that's what you learned on, right? Those were your first
It is.
book.
Yep. No, that was my very first astrology book that I cut my teeth on it and fell in love.
And Alan he was, unfortunately, he passed away during the pandemic. He was an amazing scholar, and he was a linguist. He was really, really, really brilliant guy and did a lot of translations. And then, like many of us, got into astrology, and that sort of changed his whole perspective on what he wanted to do with his life. And he was very spiritual. He really was somebody who had also a lot of studies with Buddhism and Chinese philosophy and Eastern astrology, Eastern philosophy. And his books, I think, represent the way he saw the world. He was just a really beautiful guy. And he was on Chris Brennan's podcast. It was a great interview. And Chris was telling the story of how when he was a very, very early astrologer and kind of was living hand to mouth and went to a UAC, and Alan just gave him some money just because he saw how Chris was interested in astrology and was, kind of just went to a conference because he really needed to go. And Alan was just a generous soul, you know, and I didn't know him that well, but I met him a couple of times. But I think his book is a great reflection, and it's a great learning book. So I tell people when they do ask me that question, that's one of the books I recommend.
That's amazing.
There are 2 other books I put on the list if we have time.
Yeah.
There were a couple books I put on the list, and I did this for a reason. One book is called The Plain Vanilla Astrologer, and then a little companion book called Chocolate Sauce by Pat Geisler.
Okay.
Pat Geisler, Geisler. And then a book called The Art of Predictive Astrology, another really great predictive book by Carol Rushman. I put those books up because if anybody listens to this podcast and sees the list of books, these are 2 of the most brilliant astrologers I've known. They've both since passed away. And they were your typical astrologer that I knew in the early days of women. And these really mostly were women who started doing astrology when they were housewives. They were home. Their husbands were at work. And Pat was a professional journalist. I shouldn't say that particularly, but then she got divorced. But the thing is that these women started just doing astrology for their neighbors. And you will find that there are so many brilliant astrologers who never wrote books, who never went to conferences. They didn't become board members of organizations, but they were working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, earning a living, and were so well known in their communities. And that's how people like Pat and Carol had full-time practices. And their astrology is so meat and potatoes because it's based not on anything esoteric. It's really based on all the charts that they did. And they also wrote these books later in life because once you have a full-time practice, you don't have time to write a book. And I remember talking to Carol. Carol was on the board of AFAN when I was on the board of AFAN. So we connected and saw each other at conferences. I said, Carol, you have to write a book. You have to write a book with all the information. I don't have time to write a book. So I think finally when she retired, or maybe her kids helped her, but she finally got this book together, The Art of Predictive Astrology. And Pat Geisler, same thing. She wrote this book called The Plain Vanilla Astrologer because her astrology is so black and white, meat and potatoes, really beautiful women who wrote great books, and anybody could understand them. They are so, down to earth. And then her book, Chocolate Sauce, there's a little addition that was a companion piece, was Pat's. It says, The Plain Vanilla Astrologer's Guide to the Art of Practicing Astrology. And she gives tips to people who are doing readings for people, how to keep files and come back to your clients and things like that. So that's why I put those books on the list.
Awesome.
So they were, they're great women. So.
Yeah. It's important to remember our colleagues' ancestry and what they had to go through also to practice, and any ways to be in community and be of the field.
Yeah, really. And these women in the 1950s, 60s, they were the ones who really worked in the communities, and people would come to them for readings. And a lot of them you never heard of.
Well, now we have, thanks to you. So thank you for mentioning them and pointing us their way.
Yeah. I mean, there are a zillion other books, as you know. But.
Of course. We could, you and I alone could spend probably 3 years having a podcast. So
right.
Take that.
Exactly.
Okay. But anyway, it's great having you.
Thank you so much.
And where can people find you these days, Ronnie?
Well, they can find me on my website, ronniedreyer.com. And, there are books and podcasts and my readings and my classes. I do a lot of webinars. And I teach Indian astrology, but I do webinars for people in both systems, on eclipses, on the year ahead, and things like that. And maybe soon I'll get a podcast together finally.
Do it. Just jump in.
I know.
Can't recommend it highly enough. And work with Jen Brown, because she's amazing.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you for listening to Within Orb. To learn more about the Celestial Arts Education Library, or to become a member, visit our website at CAELi.institute. That's www.caeli.institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please help spread the word. Follow or subscribe to Within Orb in your podcatcher of choice, rate it 5 stars, or write us a happy review. This helps others find the show. We also want to give a big thanks to the indie band The E-Block for contributing their song Wake Up for our intro and outro music. You can find them at their website, eblockband.com. This is Jenn Zahrt, signing off for now. See you next time.